In many regards, the quality of your life is defined by the amount of compromise you are willing or forced to make. This is especially true when you live on a boat that you build mostly yourself. Any shortcomings or flaws in your design will come back to haunt you later on and make your life miserable. As an example, my water system slowly fell apart because at the time I was willing to compromise in certain areas, and so I am now suffering the consequences as a result of it. For this reason, I've decided to take a break from building the big boat, as I could feel that I was in a position where I was ready to compromise just to finish it quickly. Instead then, I moved my attention back to my first boat, yes, the boat this channel got its name from, and decided to finish the job I started over 2.5 years ago. But before we get started, let's address the question of why I stopped working on my first boat in the first place. Several reasons come to my mind. There were other distractions. I felt like I needed more space on the water by getting another boat, but then of course this new boat needed a lot of work, as you all know. But the main reason why I didn't start any major projects on my first boat for the past year or so is very simply because I was living on it. Recently, however, I solved this problem by, you all guessed it, getting another boat. More on that later. And so for now, let me show you how I started working on what I call the forward cabin, containing the galley and the head of my first boat. Here's what the forward cabin looked like before I got started. For today's video, we're gonna focus our attention mainly to the seating area, where we're gonna start by adding some wall paneling. And I must warn you that this build is extremely tedious and I may not always follow the strict chronological order in which I did things. As always, there are very few straight lines or right angles, which requires a lot of different and specialized measuring techniques. We'll probably have to work with templates a lot. So needless to say, this is gonna be a fun project. So I got some materials: wood for the walls, plastic for the ceiling, paint for the wood. And so the first step is to paint the wooden boards with primer in order to protect them from the harsh conditions inside the boat. We'll start with the biggest wall by first taking some measurements. We made a template to get the right angle of the adjoining wall, and then we can proceed to cutting the first boards. And by the way, you may have noticed that the person you see here isn't me, it is in fact my new intern, a very talented young man who also lives on a boat and thus has an interest in learning the crafts that we display on this channel. Right, let's put the first board in place. I'm gonna use this thin wooden strip to create spacers in order to leave some space around the wooden boards that we put in. Here at the bottom, I leave about 1 centimeter of space. And on the sides, we try to leave about 2-3 millimeters so that the wood can expand with changing temperatures. With the first board cut perfectly, we can then put the next board on top of it and use our template to simply continue the angle of the adjoining wall. To get the cutout for the air vent of the diesel heater, I simply put a board in front of it, give it a few well-intended punches, and then trace the imprint on the other side with a pencil. I then cut this out and repeat the same for the upper part. Then I can put the boards in, making sure I have the right spacers on each side. Now I can also start screwing the boards onto the frame. We have a nice flush fit around that diesel heater vent. For now, I'm only gonna screw in every other board. And in this way, I proceed board by board up the wall. Underneath the door here, there's some framing missing, but we'll get to that a little later. Now I will move up the wall until that overhang there on the right. And for the rest of that wall, I'm gonna attempt to cut a whole batch of boards in one go, rather than cutting and fitting each board individually. And with the first wall in place, we can have a quick look. Overall, I managed to get a really nice initial fit, knowing that I can do some fine adjustments as we move along. As mentioned before, I still need to add some framing around the door. But for now, I can disassemble the wall and move on to painting the boards. I paint the boards not only for aesthetic reasons, as I'm personally not a big fan of the natural pattern and look of spruce wood, but also to seal and protect them further against the changes in temperature and humidity. In the meantime of letting this dry, I'm gonna cut some framing for the areas around the door. Now the framing is essential to create a solid base where one can later attach the wall panels to. And the biggest difficulty here is usually the question of how and where to attach them. Ideally, you can just screw them into existing wooden structures, such as here. In some cases, one is forced to drill holes into the steel and attach the wooden framing in that way. And in some cases, when there is neither wood or steel to screw or bolt onto, I would simply glue them in place. And I'll show you a few examples of this later on. I would also strongly recommend to put in the wooden framing before putting in the insulation to avoid having to cut and rip out pieces of insulation in order to make room for the frames. Right now, with the framing in place, we can move on to attaching the freshly painted boards. Once I reach the doorstep, I can simply draw a line along the wooden framing to get an exact cutout. And with the first wall standing, we can move on to the side walls. This will most likely be a little more challenging, not just because we'll have to make cutouts for the windows, but also because that lower part of the wall is completely curved. My friends at Anker sent me their new flagship power station, the Powerhouse 767, a solar generator that leaves hardly any boxes unchecked. Together with their 200-watt solar panel, it can recharge completely in about 2.5 hours. With a battery capacity of 2048 watt-hours and a rated maximum output of 2300 watts, you can easily power several electricity-hungry devices at the same time. The integrated display lets you monitor the consumption and remaining capacity, and there is of course an app. Of its total 10 outputs, 5 are dedicated USB-A and C ports, and of course, here too, you can charge multiple devices simultaneously. And as nice as it seems on the inside, the 767 true power gets revealed on the outside. Thanks to its durable wheels and retractable handle, you can easily bring it to wherever this coming summer leads you to. Once you deploy the large 200-watt solar panel, your power station will remain topped up for the remaining of the daytime. The solar panels have built-in stands with 3 different angle adjustments, so you can always optimize them to the exposure of the sun. Now I personally could see me use this whenever I feel like having an espresso out in the wild. And if I ever need to use the circular saw while the espresso machine is still running, I take comfort in knowing that this won't be an issue. So if you are like me and you like to bring electric devices to places where there are no electric outlets and you need a silent and environmentally friendly way of generating electricity, then check out the link in the description and find out how Anker is protecting our oceans by donating a certain amount for each 767 sold to the Oceana organization. As always, we'll start by taking some measurements, drawing some lines, and then cutting the first boards. In this spot, we first attempted to attach the wooden boards directly onto the steel by pre-drilling a pilot hole, then using self-drilling metal bolts, but it turned out to be very impractical as the bolts would get stuck in the steel halfway in, then break off, and overall this proved to be a very unreliable way of attaching the boards, Nevertheless, for now, we would attach the uppermost board so that we can continue fitting the remaining boards. We would then have to hold the boards in place by hand, but we would only get to the point where the curvature of the wall became too strong to continue fitting them in this way. So then I went ahead and added some wooden strips so we can attach the panels more easily. I would quickly add some insulation in the areas where it was missing. I used the electric plane to adjust the shape of the wooden strips, because the steel frames of the boat are of course not parallel to each other. I will attach this wooden strip with only 2 self-drilling metal bolts. In this way, I only have to drill a handful of bolts directly into the steel, because as you can see here, the process is really not smooth. With 2 wooden strips attached to either side of this wall, I decided to add a third one in the middle and to add some insulation to the remaining frames. In the meantime, the wooden boards for this wall had been painted, and so now I can put them in place. I had to fiddle around quite a bit to get the slope right at the bottom, and I ended up simply gluing most of the parts in place. Wherever necessary, I put pieces of spare wood behind the wooden panels to prevent them from breaking off if we were to hit them accidentally. I hope that with this, the hardest part is done, and so next I'm gonna deal with the overhanging part underneath the window. There's a slight curve to the wall, so I'm making a few marks on the outermost board. To draw the curve over such a long distance, I attach a flexible wooden strip on one side of the board, then bend it so it lies upon the marks I just made, and then draw the line for the cutout. Here we jump ahead a few steps to where I've already cut and painted all the boards that cover up the overhang. Next we'll deal with the wall that contains the windows. First I'm gonna have to add some wooden spacers on the wooden strips alongside that pipe. After I fit the first board, I'm gonna add a wooden strip to hide the joint. And with the second board in place, we can move on to figuring out how to get the right shape for the window. I decided to test a technique which a good friend recommended to me. In this technique, you would trace the outline of a given shape with thin wooden strips, then screw or glue them together in order to get a very accurate and rigid copy of the shape you're trying to replicate. So this is the shape I'm going for. I put 3 kinks at the larger arcs of the window and only 2 where the arcs are a bit smaller. In the meantime of letting the glue cure, let's see what we're gonna do about the second window. Here we have a corner without any attachment possibilities for the wooden frames. As mentioned earlier, this is a great spot to glue some wooden strips in place in order to get a point of attachment for the wall paneling. I'm also gonna add some very short strips in the long gaps above and below the window. Now in the meantime of letting that glue cure, we move back to the first window where we can now remove our template. But before I remove it all the way, I'm gonna add some markings at specific spots in order to find the exact same position when we put it back later on. Now I can remove the template all the way and continue with adding the roughly cut wall panels. I noticed that the grooves between the panels on the 2 walls didn't line up, which would be a sin in my opinion to leave it that way, so I took the boards back down and made sure that the grooves on the 2 sides aligned properly. Now I can start putting in place the roughly cut wall panels. I leave out the board at the top for the time being. I put in place the template. Now all I have to do is trace the line around the inner circumference of the template to hopefully get the perfect cutout for the window. I'm gonna use the same template for the left side of the other window since they have a similar shape, but in order to get the perfect shape I have to use my three-dimensional imagination, so to speak. With the shape for the cutout drawn onto the boards, I can now put in place the upper board. The intern will take care of the right side of the right window. Here I'm taking back over to draw the shape for the cutout, and on this side I decide to simply eyeball the shape, because as long as you can see enough behind the panel, it's actually easier to do it in this way. To fill the gap here at the upper frame of this window, I simply use a thin wooden strip. And with that, the shapes for the cutouts of the two windows are drawn onto all the wall panels, and we can now take everything off again and proceed to cutting. One of the things that made this build so time-consuming is that for each small change I made, I had to assemble and disassemble often the entire wall multiple times, and only when, like here, everything would fit together perfectly, I would take it all apart one last time and proceed to painting. On the other hand, putting the freshly painted boards in place, hopefully for the last time, gives you an undescribable feeling of accomplishment, which in and of itself makes the entire effort worth it. Alright, I can continue showing you this build for the next 20 minutes, and spoiler alert, it's gonna involve a lot of measuring, wood cutting and little pieces of white painted wood. In other words, not much different from what we've seen the past 15 minutes or so. Or we can talk about this new boat that I just got. So, whichever you prefer, that's what I thought. I got the boat about a month ago in an auction of all places. The starting price was really low and nobody bid on it except for me, so I basically stole this boat. It's an old tugboat built in the former GDR in 1966. Here's the original manufacturer's plate. It's very well maintained, nothing needs to be fixed urgently. The motor runs and all the electronics and amenities work perfectly for the most part. The forward cabin is nice and cozy, a little dark for my taste, but heck, I don't have to live here, so it doesn't matter. The aft cabin, currently used for storage, is big enough to include a queen-sized bed, and it's also where the head is located. The deck has a comfortable size, big enough to accommodate a dozen or so people. So far, this is just another recreational boat, nothing special. The one area where this boat differs from most recreational boats, however, is when we enter the engine room. Here's where the massive 4-stroke diesel engine resides. It has an incredible 15 liters of displacement. It weighs about 2.5 metric tons and is a so-called medium-speed engine. But more on the engine a little later. Now, because this boat was built solely for professional heavy-duty works, everything is massive and built for redundancy. You won't find any cables or hydraulic pipes. Instead, all the mechanics are done with steel bars, gears and levers. For example, the levers for throttle and transmission. And just look at this massive gear with steel bars for steering the rudder. There is a labyrinth of pipes, wheels and levers to control the water system, which for the most part had been decommissioned by the previous owner, but it gives you a good idea of the kind of work life this boat has been built for. There is even a dedicated space in the engine room for a backup starter motor. The funny thing about it is that for a tugboat it's actually tiny. It's a mere 15 meters long and 3.5 meters wide. It was most likely destined to work in an inland harbor and the narrow inland canals of eastern Germany. Alright now, enough of me rambling about the boat, let's see the boat in action. Before starting the engine, it is advised to turn the camshaft manually to a certain position where the starter motor has the least amount of work to do. Next, we'll have to open up the C-valves. Then we can put in the ignition key and preheat the glow plugs by turning and holding the ignition key at step 1. There is a little control window with a metal wire behind that will start glowing. Once the little wire is glowing, we can turn the ignition key all the way and crank the engine. Now to give you an idea of how massive this engine is compared to the size of the boat, you can see by looking out the door on the other side that the motor makes the entire boat tilt as it revs up because of the so-called gyro effect. The water cooling circuit is driven not by an impeller but by this massive dual piston water pump. Inside the helm we have a telltale window where we can check if the water is flowing or not. As everything seems to be working fine, let's get going. I asked my good friend to drive the boat for me, the same guy I always ask when I'm too scared to drive the boats myself. Now the goal of this trip was just to do a little round, try a simple docking maneuver, just so my friend can get a feel for the boat. Now this boat does not have a bow thruster, which is one of the reasons I wouldn't dare to drive it on my own at this point. My friend, however, natural-born boater that he is, did not have any issue of maneuvering the boat in such a tight spot. Right, this is close enough for me. Let's bring her back home. We installed a mooring ball where we can secure the boat with a hook on a chain. And so yeah, that's the story of my little tugboat so far. And that's all from me for today. As always, I thank you very much for watching. Remember to check out the My First Boat Facebook group. And with that, see you in the next video.